So there's this small video that was released just a couple weeks ago from a Civilization 6 YouTuber named Herson talking about Frieren. It was titled "The Worst Episode in Soso no Frieren." In a post I made today asking about takes I might disagree with in Frieren, someone suggested this video, and man do I disagree with it.
As it stands, there's not a single moment in the first season of the show where Fern or Stark makes a meaningful decision.
Come on, that's just not a single moment. But it's worth acknowledging a lot of these response videos come across as takedowns, trying to dunk on any opinion that doesn't match theirs. There's something inherently combative about them. So what I'm going to do in this video is take that combative stance, watch his video, and respond. But I'm also going to, despite how much I disagree with parts of this video, argue why I think it's a good thing, and share my own ideas about strong points he brings up. But that's the thing about video essays, they should be encouraging discussion. So in my first version of making this video, I went through and responded to everything he said, but I think that ultimately made for a pretty bad viewing experience. So instead of this video being me nitpicking every little thing he says that I disagree with, I'm instead going to talk about the three major points that he seems to be arguing. Number 1, the problems with the Old Man Vol episode. 2, Frieren's characters having a lack of agency in the story and being stuck in the past. And 3, what this implies about the world. My name is Pei, and today we're going to be talking about, potentially, Soso no Frieren's worst episode. 2 important disclaimers that I need to share before responding to his video is number 1, if you go to his channel and leave a comment on his video, that's whack and you're cringe. It reflects poorly on me and I don't want to contribute to people dogpiling over essentially inconsequential opinions on media. Second, this is not the full video. I am making cuts because I wanted my argument to feel cohesive and focused. Let's get into it.
In case you've been living under a rock, the highest rated anime of all time according to most user review websites is a relatively recent show called Soso no Frieren. Overall, it's a pretty solid show that has some pretty meaningful things to say about the value of human connection. However, I have some gripes with the show that I feel have been overlooked by the anime community at large, concerns which no other content creator has seen fit to give voice to. To best illustrate these concerns, we'll be examining episode 16.
So part of the reason I'm making this response is because later on he points to a couple of my videos as examples of content creators talking about Frieren. This is also paired with the information that one of those videos is one of my most popular and it talks about episode 16 of Frieren,
which centers around an old dwarf named Vol and the promise he made to his long deceased wife. This is the worst episode of Soso no Frieren. Right away, episode 16 fumbles its themes a bit. You see, the previous episode had been entirely about the value of having trust in other people.
Kinda. The moral of that episode I don't think is built around just trust. There's more moving pieces than that, but we'll get to that in a second.
The whole party had been put to sleep by a curse, leaving the newest member, Sign, alone against a powerful monster. Despite his best efforts, he's unable to damage the monster, forcing him to rely on the one thing he can do: utilize a spell to wake one of his party members for a mere 5 seconds. Earlier, Frieren had confidently stated before falling asleep that 5 seconds would be sufficient for her to defeat the monster on her own, but Sign wavers. Eventually, he gets a flashback where he remembers a lecture he received on the value of trust, and he decides to put his faith in Frieren and wakes her. Of course, she defeats the monster as promised. Thus concludes a nice little tale about the value of trusting your companions, even in cases where you don't fully understand them.
Yes, this is about trusting a companion in a high-risk situation, taking a leap of faith, and putting your life in someone else's hands. I think it's more about giving trust to those who've earned it than it is just a general lesson about trusting people.
So, imagine my shock when the literal very next episode opens with this scene. Our party is coming up to a village, and Frieren tells her companion stories about a trusted friend of hers that lives there.
Okay, so I had to go back and rewatch this scene because the way he explains it is disconnected from the way I remember it. Frieren doesn't really say anything explicitly about trust here. The closest thing you could point at is her referring to Vol as a long-lived friend. I think the primary purpose of this scene is to give you a couple important pieces of information. The first is that Vol is old, almost 400 years when the average life of a dwarf is around 300. The second is that he's a renowned, strong warrior that spent most of his life protecting this town. And the third is that he's one of Frieren's longtime friends.
So, what's the very first thing Vol does?
Okay, that's not what he says. I think the emoji indicates that this is a joke, but I still think it's misleading to replace the subtitles here. And I guess you could take these quotes out of context and infer it has something to do with trust. But this moment isn't unprompted or random like he implies and continues to argue in a second. Because in the scenes that preface this, Stark asks if he's a great warrior, Frieren hypes him up. Then, when they finally arrive in front of him, she asks if he seems as great as she made him out to be. Then Stark not once but twice underestimates him, referring to his age and calling him decrepit.
Huh? He sucker punches the party's warrior, Stark, injuring him to the point of being unable to walk.
Using the term sucker punches and injuring feels overblown and exaggerated. While the characters are shocked, no one treats it with a lot of severity.
Vol then goes on a rant about how trust is a weakness, and that true warriors never let their guards down, even among friends.
To me, the rant feels so much more about preparedness and staying on your toes. He never explicitly says anything about trust, especially in context where he, in front of the old man, underestimates his ability to be a great warrior because of his age. To argue there's subtext about trust here and not even call it subtext feels like a stretch.
For some reason, this is accepted by the party as being some kind of profound wisdom, and Vol is forgiven for his brazen, unprovoked assault.
Brazen or extreme, maybe, but it's definitely not unprovoked. A young warrior overconfidently questions an old man's ability to fight based off of his age and then gets his leg swept. This is like almost a cliche. Also, once again, assault is such a strong word.
We then learn the backstory of Vol. He's lived for 400 years, far longer than the average life expectancy of dwarves in this setting, and he spent all that time guarding this village. He's a total hermit, having no real friends and never engaging with the community he's sworn his life to.
Yes, at this point it's stated that he's not engaging with the community that he's protecting. But cutting to a shot where Frieren and Vol are talking, two old friends, while claiming he doesn't have any real friends, feels like an odd choice. There's a lot being inferred here based off of very little information, some of which runs contrary to the direction of the episode. Vol voices that he's grateful for his friendship with Frieren. It's a big part of this story, but something to remember is that this is an old dwarf near the end of his life. We don't know if he interacted with previous generations. There's a possibility talking to the townspeople felt weird, like an adult going to preschool. A big part of Frieren's story is her age, but something that's important to remember is she's still very youthful. She has energy and is far from any sort of natural death. A major part of this episode and Vol's story is his age and how it's showing.
We're told that Vol hardly ever speaks to anyone, to the point where the people of the village have forgotten why he even stands guard over them in the first place. His motive for doing this, as it turns out, is a promise he made to his human wife, who passed away hundreds of years ago. Even though he can no longer even remember her face, he lives his life in service to the promise he made to her. Now, I don't think it's particularly outlandish for me to take a look at this scenario and question if Vol is, perhaps, completely wasting his life.
Okay, pause. I do think that's an outlandish thing to say. A complete waste of his life feels like a really aggressive way to argue that you think he should be doing something else. I think a big part of what makes this episode so beautiful is this almost unrequited expression of love.
The problem here isn't his dedication to defending the village, but his decision to isolate himself from the people living in it.
But why is that a problem?
Being totally alone for hundreds of years has to be completely miserable.
First, we know he hasn't been completely alone all 400 years. We know he had a relationship with his wife. We know that he's friends with Frieren. There's a possibility other friends exist. Just because they aren't explicitly shown to us, the audience, doesn't mean we can assume they don't. Second, tons of people live generally reclusive lifestyles, and small amounts of interaction are enough for them. He sees a very different story with Vol than I do. This feels like a pretty crucial part of his argument against episode 16.
And given that this is a show that's supposedly about the value of connecting with other people, I'd expect the author to understand this.
I do think the story is about valuing connections with others, but I think connections come in many different shapes and forms. I think the central theme of this episode is that we carry the people we've lost on with us in memory and actions. Vol's dedication to the promise he made his wife is represented every day in choosing to continue engaging with it, even when that memory starts to fade.
Surely, the reason that Vol's wife asked him to guard the village is because she loved the village and the people who lived there.
Yes.
Assuming this is the case, then while Vol has remembered the contents of the promise he made, his isolation reveals that he has forgotten the true reasons behind it.
No. What? An important part of Frieren's story that we're shown a couple different times is that before the Demon King was killed, the world was very dangerous. There's a very realistic chance that she was just asking for him to protect this town of people she loved from danger. I mean, there could be subtext, but that's never indicated the entire time.
We'd have the setup for a good story. Thus, there's an obvious direction that this episode is practically begging to go in.
He goes on a long tangent after this about what he thinks the story should have been, and I found myself arguing a bunch of different random tangential things. The overall point being I heavily prefer the version Frieren gave over his.
In the actual episode, events unfold very differently. In this episode, Vol is never challenged regarding his decision to live his life in complete solitude.
This returns to that idea that Vol's lifestyle is a problem that needs to be fixed. But in reality, the audience and characters in the story have an incredibly limited viewpoint of his life. I mean, he's almost 400 years old. If anyone knows him, it's probably Frieren, and she doesn't seem very worried.
In fact, I'd go so far as to say that his lifestyle is depicted as admirable. At one point in the episode, as Vol is reminiscing with Frieren, we get a flashback to some 80 years ago, when Frieren's previous party visited the village. Vol expresses to this party his doubts about the way he's chosen to live his life.
わしは遠い昔に交わした約束を果たしているに過ぎん。滑稽な話だろう。わしはずっと死者との約束を守っている。
The leader of Frieren's party, Himmel the hero, takes offense at Vol doubting the nobility of his lifestyle. He affirms that Vol is doing the right thing and that he's living the way his wife would have wanted. Back in the present, as Vol reflects on this moment, his resolve to continue living his life in solitude is reaffirmed. In case it wasn't clear enough that the author believes that this is the correct mindset, Vol reveals on the following day that he dreamt of his wife's face for the first time in decades that very night.
Generally, it's a good rule to avoid claiming authorial intent. It's very wishy-washy and inexact. You can infer based off of perceived themes what the author was getting at. It's far from concrete, and even with seemingly clear examples, it's still often hotly debated. Outside of an author stating what they meant, you can only really make an educated guess. A much easier thing to look at, and still not concrete, is how art is interpreted, because you have more evidence. So how is my interpretation different from Herson's? I think Vol has dedicated his life to a noble pursuit, seeing through his late wife's wish. And now, in his old age with his memory slipping, he makes the decision every day still to protect that town. And while he's lost the memory of her voice and face, his love for her is still there, serving as a foundation for his commitment to protecting the town. The reason this is treated like it's noble is because it is. This is a choice he continues to make, even when it doesn't make as much sense as it once did. He then acknowledges to Himmel that this may seem silly from the outside perspective looking in. Some might argue it's a fruitless pursuit, but Himmel understands, and he assures the man to continue making the decisions he wants to. I think Old Man Vol's story is built around two major components. The first is the main theme, that we carry on our lost loved ones in the actions and decisions we make every day. They're not truly gone as long as their influence remains. And the primary conflict is built around Vol's old age and slipping memory. Both of these ideas are introduced from the very start of the episode, and seen all the way through the climax. He's introduced as the 400-year-old dwarf warrior who protects this town, and Frieren immediately asks if he's still pretending to be senile. And then there's the emotional climax of the episode where she realizes he is losing his memory, and it hits her and is tragic because he's one of her oldest friends, one of the few people that exist in a world that isn't made for them, living through many generations of humans who all exist with such an urgency. Vol and Frieren both seem very content living their peaceful lives, but they also both have people they deeply care about, people that they've lost. But they're not relics of the past, they're carried into the future in every action they take, influencing Frieren and Vol's decisions day by day. So when Frieren finds out that one of her oldest friends, a dwarf that should have probably died 100 years ago's age is finally showing, I think she's shocked by the tragedy. But then she remembers the lesson that Himmel taught her, that our past experiences inform the now. We carry the ones we love in every decision we make, in all the ways they influenced us. And then she tells Vol that he'll be carried with her when she's gone, and he's comforted by that. I think Vol's story is beautiful, and I know a lot of people love this episode. That's why I find this next argument so shocking.
Vol chose to live in the past rather than the present, and he was rewarded for it. Now, I don't think it's a stretch to say that this episode is firmly at odds with the idea that Soso no Frieren is a show about valuing human connection.
I think it is a stretch, because I think this episode beautifully highlights the value of human connection, showcased in one of the many forms it comes in.
However, I may have fibbed a bit when I implied earlier that this episode is alone in this regard. In reality, the Vol episode is a microcosm for the problems that permeate every single aspect of the writing in this anime. Remember that scene when Himmel the hero affirmed Vol's lifestyle? This actually wasn't out of character at all for Himmel. In fact, Himmel's life has a significant number of disturbing parallels to Vol's. After the party that Himmel journeyed with for 10 years in order to save the world disbanded, what did he actually do with his life? In the anime, it seems as though he didn't do much of anything. When he meets back up with his former party members 50 years later, we get numerous scenes of them reminiscing about the past, but no scenes of them catching each other up on their exploits over the 50 years they spent separated. There's no concrete evidence that Himmel ever went on any more adventures, formed any new friendships, picked up any new hobbies, or did much of anything in that 50-year span.
They didn't talk about Himmel's life and exploits because stories have very limited time and audiences have limited attention. The story's titled Frieren Beyond Journey's End, and possibly the reason why we're not given much information about Himmel's life after the hero's journey is because Frieren is the point of view protagonist. And the point they're trying to make in the first episode is that Frieren's disconnected and kinda doesn't care. And she doesn't realize that until he's gone.
There is one thing we do know that he did, however.
Is it that in episode 3 they showcased Himmel consistently visiting the town where Qual was sealed to make sure that it wasn't decaying? Or I don't know, the fact that a major point in Himmel's heroism is that he didn't just do big things, he also helped people in small ways. And probably if he had time to do that while he was saving the world, he probably had time after. No, it's not those?
He lamented his inability to court Frieren. Thus, he stewed in regret and lived in isolation after their party disbanded, accomplishing nothing new until the day he died. Much like Vol, Himmel never moved on.
Outside of Himmel seemingly not having a partner, there are very few points of evidence that suggest Himmel was lamenting, let alone lived an isolated life. There's actually evidence to indicate the opposite. Unlike Vol, we know a lot about Himmel's character and how social he was. We do know that Himmel didn't meet someone else and marry them, and that implies something, but to say that he clearly stewed in regret because of it, it feels like a stretch.
In fact, nobody in the show ever moves on. In episode 15, the party runs into a nobleman named Orden. His son recently died in battle, and in order to conceal this fact and keep morale among his men high, he contracts a member of Frieren's party to impersonate his dead son at an upcoming ball. This is a deeply uncomfortable premise and raises numerous ethical and philosophical questions. However, the show is utterly uninterested in exploring them. Stark, who is assigned the role of impersonating Orden's son, never once expresses doubt over the deceitful nature of this quest, nor the weird psychological hang-up that Orden seems to have when it comes to denying his own son's death.
Okay, so I think this is where the value of a video like this really comes into play. It's making me think about Orden's story. Because Orden finds himself at a unique crossroads, trying to accept the loss of his son while also bearing the responsibility of a monarch, a king afraid that his people might panic if they find out his heir is dead.
Orden's not the only father in the show whose life is haunted by the memory of his deceased son. Several episodes prior, we met another nobleman by the name of Granat, whose own son was also slain in battle by demons.
He's right, 2 noblemen haunted by the loss of their sons, both coping in different ways. This parallel's really interesting, and I didn't think about it before this video.
It's just another example of a long line of characters in this show having their entire life's purpose laid out for them by their deceased loved ones.
Wait, what?
Virtually every character in Soso no Frieren is haunted by the ghosts of the relationships they've lost.
Okay, I'm back on board. I don't know what I was talking about a second ago, but a major theme in Frieren is looking at the way past relationships influence our actions now.
Just as Vol dedicates himself to his dead wife and Orden and Granat dedicate themselves to their dead sons, every member of Frieren's party set out on their journey because of a relationship they've lost. Frieren regrets not getting to know her previous party members better, and so she's venturing to a realm that allows her to commune with the dead. Fern follows Frieren because she wishes to live up to the expectations of Hyder, the man who raised her. Stark follows Frieren because he feels guilt over not having been a strong enough warrior to fight alongside his deceased brother and father.
I think Stark's journey also has to do with the loss of his relationship with Eisen, wanting to go on an adventure and bring those stories back to him.
Even Sign, who joins the party for a few episodes before departing, only goes adventuring in order to search for a childhood friend of his that he regrets parting ways with.
Wait, no. You're definitely right that he wants to reconnect with his childhood friend, but they grew up idealizing being an adventurer, dreaming about exploring the world, being the heroes of their own story. Finding guerrilla warriors definitely a priority, but leaving home when he feels like he's past his prime and going on his own adventure is a feat in itself. It's a decision that takes some convincing, but in the end, he makes himself a choice to engage instead of letting life pass him by.
All of these characters have had their main goal in life thrust upon them by someone else, rather than it being something that they chose for themselves.
All of these characters' goals, with the exception of maybe Fern, are a result of them making a decision that they regret, and then in the future learning from that mistake and making a new decision to engage. All of them were stuck because of their own choices. Stark chose to stay in the town because of the nearby dragon. Zine refused to go with Guerrilla Warrior because he couldn't choose to leave his brother behind, and Frieren across 1,000 years chose time and time again to disconnect from society. Each one of these characters' story starts with them choosing to engage. Stark fights the dragon he's terrified of, Zine leaves home, and Frieren chooses to go on an adventure.
This extends further than just their primary objectives, however. Every single detour and side quest that our characters set out on in this show is something that was thrust upon them, never something that they chose for themselves. There are no subplots in Soso no Frieren where the inciting incident comes from a choice made by one of the party members. All of them are mere passengers in the story that react to the things that happen around them, as opposed to being in the driver's seat and creating the action themselves.
There are stories where main characters do feel like passengers, but in Frieren, the characters are constantly making choices that are informed by circumstance. There's no separating the two. Even the clip he's using at this point in the video demonstrates that. Frieren sees a demon in the city and chooses to pull a proverbial gun on him. That roadblock of her then being imprisoned is a direct result of her actions. I'd almost argue the opposite, that a majority of the subplots in the story are direct decisions made by a character, because most of them don't actually have to happen. Take the choice to stop and fight that monster that makes people sleep in episode 15. Frieren suggests they move on, the risk is too great, but Fern insists that they stay. Or Frieren's choice to find blue moonweed in episode 2 that leads to conflict between her and Fern, where Fern has to advocate for herself.
Everything the party does happens only because the responsibility to act was thrust upon them. They witness some grave threat to human life, they run out of money, or they encounter some sort of roadblock, and then the story develops from there. For once, I'd like to see an episode where the plot is driven by the desires of the characters, rather than the circumstances they find themselves in.
Even though we as the audience can probably infer that our likable protagonists aren't going to abandon people in a time of need, it's still a decision that the characters are making. And multiple times in Frieren, they highlight just how much these choices don't have to be made. They could have left the demons that were threatening Granat's domain. They didn't owe the city that, especially after Frieren was imprisoned. Fern and Stark didn't have to fight the lesser demons, but this is a story about heroism. And many of these little subplots, especially in the first half of the season, of less important storylines are all a byproduct of them following their desires.
As it stands, there's not a single moment in the first season of the show where Fern or Stark makes a meaningful decision.
Come on, that's just not a single moment.
Furthermore, the characters aren't just passive in the way they approach their journey, they're also passive in the way they engage in forming connections with other people. In the worldview of Soso no Frieren, a relationship isn't something that someone goes out of their way to form, but is instead something which is thrust upon them through chance. Characters don't choose to become friends with other people, can't choose to become friends with other people. This is the reason that the author of Soso no Frieren feels the need to write so much about the importance of cherishing the connections people form with each other. If people have no agency over forming relationships, then every relationship is truly irreplaceable.
No one has to connect with anyone. There are tons of people who are forced to interact constantly, who never have friendships or relationships develop. Now, I guess a lot of relationships are driven by circumstance. It's convenient to get to know someone when you're forced to be around them. But how many classmates or coworkers do you see every day that you don't go out of your way to create a relationship with? Sometimes it doesn't take much, but all relationships require some level of effort. And yes, convenience can supplement that, but still a baseline for developing any relationship is effort. The only exception I can think of are relationships that are often conflated with titles. Like sometimes family can feel more like a title than a relationship.
The modern world is facing an unprecedented loneliness epidemic due to the advent of the internet, exacerbated by the lockdowns from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, so this is a whole bag of worms that I'm not actually going to get into, but the discussion around the loneliness epidemic is actually really complicated. The internet has both positive and negative impacts on people's loneliness, and the positive effects were especially apparent when people were forced to isolate during COVID. There's a great podcast called If Books Could Kill, where they talk about the anxious generation, where they go over this in way more detail. If you want to know more about the pitfalls of this argument, that episode does an outstanding job.
Birth rates are way down, virginity rates are skyrocketing, and polls reveal that more and more people say that they have no close friends at all.
Okay, all of these graphs are interesting, but the application to the argument that's being made here is really wishy-washy. The most obvious example is that last graph was based off of a poll in May of 2021, when the effects of COVID were incredibly prominent. The second is that while decreasing birth rates and increased rates of virginity might be indicative of loneliness, there's tons of other reasons why those could be happening. I don't know, cost of living for birth rates is a really obvious example. I do think that there's evidence that there's this loneliness epidemic going on. I just think people seem to overgeneralize solutions towards what feels intuitive. And I think that this evidence doesn't at all support what he's about to claim.
This is the world that chose to elevate an anime like Soso no Frieren to the #1 rated spot of all time on user review aggregators, an anime which tells people that there's nothing they can do to solve their loneliness.
It's just amazing how opposite this is to what I interpret Frieren to be about. Frieren's a story about valuing relationships and choosing to engage. I think there are points in this video that are really interesting, like how many characters' stories start with the loss of a loved one. He highlighted multiple parallels between characters that I never paid attention to until now. That's why I think even despite how much I disagree with this video, that it's still a good thing. People sharing their perspective and experience of a story is interesting and allows you to approach it from different angles, especially when you don't agree. And I don't think I have to ask you to trust me when I say I don't agree with this video. In this next part, he advocates for something that showcases to me some underlying good intention. It's a piece of advice that should be considered, albeit with a grain of salt.
Please, if you are a lonely person and you enjoyed Soso no Frieren, I want you to take a moment to reflect on the way that you view human connections. You don't have to wait around for friends to appear, you can take an active role in forming friendships for yourself. Go to in-person conventions, join an online community, do something to make a change in your life.
I also believe that a more active pursuit of connecting with others would benefit people. Ironically enough, I think that's why I like Frieren so much. It feels like one of the central themes. But hell, if I experienced Frieren the way this guy did, I also probably wouldn't like it.
Maybe you could even watch an original anime for once, instead of the 100th power fantasy in a JRPG fantasy setting.
Oh man, right when he got me on his side, he hits me with this. It's such a strong opposite opinion from like every conversation I've had about Frieren with anyone that's watched it. But then again, Frieren's like a majority of what I do on YouTube. Of course, I'm going to be surrounded by people that like it. This still feels like a rare take for even people who didn't like the show. He goes on to share a couple anime that he thinks are more deserving of the praise and attention that Frieren seems to be getting. Frieren is popular and praised for a lot of reasons, but I don't think a prominent one is that it's some sort of cathartic viewing experience for socially isolated incels that encourages them to be unhealthy. Mostly just some weird racist people on Twitter sometimes.
It actually gnawed at me how I've never seen any other content creators make this, frankly, obvious observation about Soso no Frieren.
Look, there I am. Twice. I don't think it's supported, let alone obvious, that Frieren encourages people to take a passive path in life. He seems to just be arguing that there's this broken cultural phenomena that's propping up Frieren as the #1 anime on user-reviewed sites. There are more moments I could have paused and critiqued, but overall that's not really the point. Ultimately, this video did get me thinking a lot. This is one of the longer videos I've done on Frieren. Actually way too long for a weekly upload schedule. I worked so hard on this video. I like the show a lot, and I like talking about it even more. This has led to me cultivating a community of people who also really like this show. So it's easy to forget that there's lots of people who don't. And some of their points are going to be not great, and other ones are going to be stuff I've never really thought about before. I think that's interesting. What do you think? And if you do choose to write an opinion down below, try to do it nicely. We're just two guys on the internet talking about anime. It's not that serious.